Now, if we contextualize Martin Luther and say the Reformation was a good thing, despite the fact that he said, kill and slay the peasants, wherever you find them, when they followed Thomas Müntzer, when he was calling for not just breaking away from the papal authority, but also for rebelling against the monarchies and the dictators that they found themselves in. Martin Luther sided with the tyrants against Müntzer and said, kill the peasants wherever you find them. Despite that, I'm prepared to say the Reformation was a good thing. And the reason I'm prepared to say that is that Martin Luther must not be judged by the standards of civilization that we, after an accumulation of thousands of years, have arrived at. He must be judged by the standards of civilization that were around during his time. And that's how society evolves. And we recognize that for every other faith and for every other piece of literature, yet when it comes to Islam, somehow we want to suspend what we've learned about that and quote verbatim from texts.
Yes, we read things in their context. I mean, you read Chaucer in context. Chaucer doesn't have followers. He doesn't have 1.4 billion people who believe everything.
Sorry, I quoted Martin Luther, not Chaucer.
Or are meant to believe everything. I
suppose Martin Luther does have followers.
If you allowed me to speak, I'd address your Luther point. I'll get there, I promise.
Right.
You don't have followers of Shakespeare who insist on, or are meant to be insist on line by line following everything Shakespeare did and believing everything he wrote. That's because it's literature. Actually, what's happening, Majid, is you've put your finger on the problem.
Absolutely.
It's not us that isn't applying the rigorous critical faculties. We're applying them to the Quran as we would to any other work of literature. You're not, because you can't. And the final thing on that, if Majid...
What do you mean that he can't?
Well, because Majid knows very well that if
he's a believer. And believers are not allowed to contextualize the text.
Is that true?
Can I bring you back to my question? What about Martin Luther?
Is that really true?
If you were allowed to contextualize, you would say some of the things that Muhammad did is crap. You would say some of the things
Majid, is it true that you
great.
cannot?
So you contextualize.
Is that true?
No, it's not true. Now, can I say...
What do you think of Muhammad taking a 6-year-old as a bride? What do you think of that?
I don't think that's a particularly good idea. However, what I would say is that there are many, many people in history that have done such a thing. And what we're talking about here is the failure to contextualize actions for the standards of their time. And I'll come back to the point I made, because, Douglas, you didn't address it despite your protestations that you were going to. Now, let me just ask you again. Martin Luther was a fundamentalist, wasn't he?
Absolutely.
All Christians will agree with you that he was a fundamentalist.
Can I now answer Majid's
Please.
Yes.
And then I want to bring in Zeba.
If there were currently Lutherans, there are Lutherans around, you meet them occasionally in Scandinavia and so on, very nice, very nice it is, and peaceable guys they are by and large. If, however, there was a large proportion of Lutherans somewhere in Scandinavia that started blowing up non-Lutherans, or no, sorry, let's be absolutely right, started massacring peasants, do you think the people would say, hang on a minute, let's not criticise Martin Luther, he did that by the standards of his time, we shouldn't criticise his followers all that much, we shouldn't point out what he said and so on. No, we just say, you know, don't go and massacre peasants, full stop. It was rubbish at
Douglas,
the time, it's rubbish now, it's the same with the Quran.
You're missing the point. If you're failing to judge...
Let me bring in your...
And in fact, what you find common with all of the movements that you're worried about and that I'm worried about and we're all worried about are that they are founded by people who do not have a theological background. Now, for all we think of Al-Azhar and their very conservative views, what we don't find is that Al-Azhar produces the likes of Bin Laden and Hassan al-Banna, or even Maududi, the founder of the Jamaat Islami in the Indian subcontinent. Maududi was a journalist. Sayyid Qutb, the founder of modern-day jihadism, was a literary critic who came to America on a scholarship in the 1950s to study literature. He was not a theologian. So coming back to the point, please, Ayan, don't define for the whole world who a Muslim scholar is. Because actually the people you refer to were not qualified theologians.
But don't you...
15 seconds,
I promise. Majid's trying to imply that the whole extremist problem is a sort of misreading by engineers and literary critics. Unfortunately, that's simply not the case, hasn't been historically in Islam, and isn't now. Ayatollah Khomeini, who Ayan mentioned earlier, was not a self-trained engineer, rich boy like Bin Laden, unfortunately, and managed to hurtle a very developed, distinguished culture back in time, in 1979, and hurtled this country back into the state it's currently in, under these cloaked dictators. The Grand Mufti of Egypt, is not a self-taught,
we see where you're going, and
yet he taught people the idea that all Muslims should go and fight the Israelis with the Hezbollah. But don't we get back to one of the core problems which you still haven't addressed, which is the life of Muhammad and his teachings, which is as follows, is that if a Christian group decides to go back to the teachings of Christ, you know, the worst stuff they find is the Sermon on the Mount of Olives. They can find one verse where Jesus is said, I think the Gospel of St. Matthew, to have said, I come not to bring peace but a sword. But the rest of it is all love thy neighbour and all that sort of stuff. If you're a Christian group looking to go back to the sources of Christianity, you just find a lot of, well, hippie stuff for a lot of modern people. So what is it about this religion we're talking about tonight that you say is a religion of peace, that when people go back to the origins, they find a founder who was violent, teaching violence?
His time. So the fact that Douglas referred to the fact that he had a bride that was underage is something which we can now look back on and say that was an awful practice. But just as we look back on many things that Romans did and say that was an awful practice, just as we look back on many things that Martin Luther did and said that was an awful practice. But we don't judge these men by the standards that we have today.
Let's bring in Douglas Murray.
No, we do, and we should. We should, Majid. And may I say, it's a bit too cutesy to compare a man who raped a 9-year-old girl repeatedly with men being, the wife's a bit of the master of the household and so on. A bit too cutesy and a bit too much avoiding the issue, which is this, that this is actually a very real concern which doesn't just apply in mid-7th century Arabia, but today, here and now, in Britain. In my own country, we now have, thanks to an arbitration act put into a law in the 1990s, whereby people can have civil disputes arbitrated under laws that they can decide on, that we now have Sharia courts in Great Britain. And the Sharia courts that in Great Britain are operated by people who are actually clerics. They are religious authorities. There's one at the moment, Siddiqui in Leicestershire. Now this man runs a set of Sharia courts. A couple of years ago, it turned out that we found out a little bit about the sort of thing he was deciding. And sadly, again, it's not reformist stuff, because when you go back to the Sharia, people take the lessons from it and they make judgments like the following. Six women who had gone to the Sharia courts because they were being physically abused by their husbands. They were persuaded to drop the cases because this should be a matter between a Muslim woman and her Muslim husband and the Sharia court. This should not be a matter for the police in Great Britain in 2008. That stinks. What's more, there was in another case, a local Muslim man died. His will was arbitrated by Sharia because that was what happens now in 21st century Britain. And the arbitration of this man's will gave half the inheritance to the daughters as to the sons of the man, because that's what you have in the Quran.
But
so it's all very well to say
that
it's something you
said that he agrees with you that this stuff needs to change.
But the point is that when you look at the courts that are doing this, when you look at the religious authorities, when you look at the clerics, the judgments they're making, those are the kinds of judgments. I wish that Majid would get some clerics on his side who could set up rival Sharia courts that didn't decide that women were second-class citizens. But sadly, at the moment, that is the case.
Dr. Tariq Qadri's fatwa against terrorism. Now, the reason why there aren't many more such examples, though there are quite a few, is because prior to Dr. Tariq Qadri issuing this fatwa, his colleague, who was also from the same way of thinking, was assassinated in Pakistan, was killed by a suicide bomber in a mosque where all the other congregants who were praying were also blown to smithereens because he had the guts to simply give a sermon in that mosque condemning suicide bombings. And so this is why many people are scared, because it takes guts, I tell you, to go into Pakistan and try and challenge these extremists. That's a country that doesn't have much rule of law. It's a country that's struggling against the so-called Pakistani Taliban from taking over a third of their country. And they're fighting that fight on the front lines. And there are those who are brave enough just to give a speech to condemn terrorism, and they're blown to smithereens in their mosque while praying. And surely they're religious people. They were praying in a mosque, Douglas. You did support that fatwa, though, didn't you?
I did. It's the only time I've ever done a book review of a fatwa. I'm sorry to say this, though, Majid, you seem to have just proved our point.
Yes.
Please explain.
Is it? I mean, I'm very grateful. It's a very important and very interesting question, why more people don't stand up. I much admire Al-Qadri for that fatwa, as I have other people who have stood up. But the number of times I've spoken to clerics behind closed doors and so on, and you say, why aren't you saying anything? They say, because if I do speak up, I'll be killed. Well, I address you again, ladies and gentlemen, to the motion.
No, but hold on. Sorry. Right, hang on. How on earth does fear of being killed in Pakistan by a minority faction of extremists prove Islam is not a religion of peace?
Let me put it this way. Let me put it this way then.
No, sorry, I've got to... Because really, what you've just said is really quite absurd, and I've got to clarify. It takes one person to kill all of us here. One person in a suicide bombing. Now, if we were scared of saying what we're saying now because of that one person, it doesn't mean all of us love war and hate peace in any way whatsoever. It means we all fear that one person who could walk through that door with a suicide bomb jacket strapped to his chest.
If we were discussing Quakerism here tonight, does anyone think that when a Quaker said, I'm quite fearful about speaking up against certain things in my faith, come on, this only happens with Islam. There is no other major faith in the world today where it is the case that people are fearful of addressing religion because they're afraid they'll be killed. It's only Islam, and we're saying there's a reason.
I've got to say one last thing. The thing is, you're not the only one on this panel. I have an Al-Qaeda death threat on my head too because I'm saying what I'm saying. And what I'm saying is that, and I've been attacked in Pakistan physically for saying this, what I'm saying is enough to extremism, enough to terrorism, let's separate Islam from extremism and disempower the minority of extremists who are trying to hijack a good faith.
Douglas, you've had death threats as well.
Minority.
You have also had death threats.
Sure. I mean, one of the points about this area is everyone gets death threats. Well, I mean, it's just an unfortunate thing about this debate.
I think Zeba and I are going to leave the
mean, as I say again, I think it speaks for itself. I hope no one threatens a chair.
The last point was that it is both. It's not just a religion of peace. It's also a religion of war, and both verses prove that.
Okay. But do you want to respond to that, Zeba, or do you want to...
I think I'll have to come back.
Okay. Douglas.
That is an important one. Ayan and I and people who make some of the points we make are often accused of taking bits of the Quran out of context. I think you've just seen a very good example of it from the other side. I'm not saying that that isn't a good verse to live one's life by. One cannot just simply quote the verse about there being no compulsion in religion as though it doesn't have
the other ones either
a
without
follow-on.
context.
It has
as though it doesn't have a follow-on. And as
ones.
Ayan has just showed you, it has a follow-on. So I think this gets back to the very important question the lady halfway back there made, which is whether or not this can be a religion of peace. I believe it can be. And when I said earlier there are three types of Islam I identified, I said the first one, the scriptures, the life of Muhammad and so on, bad. Second one, Sharia, interpretations, bad. But thirdly, the way Muslims live their lives today, in this country and countries like it, that is our source for hope. And the source of hope for that is that they individually use, like many people do religion. I'm not a religious person, Ayan isn't either. But we recognise the fact that people of religious faith have the right to that faith, should practice that faith, should have no fear of practicing that faith. There's no problem with this. But it's a private matter, and one which people come to very strange private arrangements about. And I just wanted to add this, which is that if those people are going to be able to reform that faith into the religion of peace you're talking about, then yes, we would be the first people to encourage them. But if we're going to have that debate, as I hope we've shown tonight, it has to start with honesty.
Let's do one more round of questions. It has to start with
frankness.
We have,
I do have to. This is a very, very complex one, but this has to be said. Majid's just given the comparison with the Founding Fathers, and there has to be some clarity about this. This country rightly reveres your Founding Fathers, but you don't think that their word was immutable or unchangeable. Yeah. You don't believe, I don't think that anyone in this room who criticised Mr. Jefferson now here tonight will be declared an anti-American apostate who can be fit for slaughter. The problem that our opponents have to address, this, is that in a religion which is based on the idea that the Quran was dictated direct by God to Muhammad, and that therefore if you are criticizing the Quran or throwing out bits or pulling it apart, like most Christians and Jews have come to that stage, where pretty much you pick a mix with your holy scriptures, and it's quite a good, humane way around it. But with Islam, if this is the revealed word of God, revealed, it has to be said, as it was shown again earlier tonight, in a particularly obscure and unreadable dialect, which, if it was meant to be understood by the whole of the world, it's a bad place to start. If this were the case, then, as I say, we come back to this problem. The Founding Fathers said many great things and did some bad things, but you are not committed as Americans not to criticize the bad things they did, and this is a problem our opponents are going to have to address. We don't think there's a fight between Islam and the West, or Islam and civilization, or anything else like that. We've made a very clear set of points tonight, and one of those points, which I hope people will bear in mind, is we have said repeatedly that it is in Muslims and their critical faculties, Muslims and their behavior, Muslims and their faith, that we have hope. And it is in people like you that we have hope for the future. And if the motion were that Islam a century from now could be a religion of peace, and people would be quoting Ziba and Majid and seminal moments like this, and that they had learned, well, that would be terrific. But at the moment, tonight, you're being asked to vote on whether Islam is now a religion of peace. Is Islam a religion of peace? I think it is very clear that it is not. This does not mean, of course it doesn't mean, that Muslims are all violent. We would never make that point. We never have made that point. Nor does it mean that there isn't hope in the future. Nor does it mean that we have to have continual clashes till the end of time. But it means we have to start by being honest. We have to be frank about what we see in Islamic history, in Islamic conquests, and in Islamic scripts. We have to be frank about that. In societies which Islam dominated, conquered, and subdued the peoples in the Middle Ages, people who were not Muslims were sometimes allowed to remain in those societies, but they were allowed to do so only by having second-class status, dhimmi status. I would ask you tonight, ladies and gentlemen, not to be dhimmis, not to have second-class status, not to vote for things because you think it's polite or because you think you have to say them, but because you think they're true. On that basis, the idea you could vote for the motion tonight is absurd. Islam is palpably, demonstrably, evidently not a religion of peace. Vote against this motion. Thank you.
Thank you.